So let's have another conversation in our series, and today we talk about the senses. Now, when I initially proposed the topic, I really meant something of a not so esoteric conversation, but really just talking about the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the sense of hearing, touch, interoception, etc. To go into those senses also that we don't often talk about, but they're there and they're part of our daily experience. And we will get into different topics or aspects of it as usual, of when the senses kind of start to deceive us, or we start to abuse them or overemphasize one over the other. Mm-hmm. But just to lay out the ground, my reason for bringing up this topic was one of the first things that I got interested in was mindfulness, and I got interested in it by listening to one of Jordan Kabat-Zinn's talks. And it was a talk about his book, the newer version of his old book, Full Catastrophe Living, which he titled Coming to Our Senses, and I really loved the title. And in that, he goes through the different senses and talks about different meditations. And that was, in a way, my first recontact or conscious contact again with embodiment. I've been doing sports and many different things, and I've always been interested in some of the yogic stuff and so on. I have picked up many different things, but also forgotten them quite easily. And this was the book that really brought me back to embodied experience of living and trying to explore it consciously. So that was the inspiration behind the topic, and also just this sense of let's simplify this a bit. And before we talk about connecting with the divine, let's go back again to the little bit of divine or mundane, whatever somebody calls it, that is right here, that is always here. So what would you want to start with when talking about senses? Can you give us a sort of an overview or intro from your point of view on how important they are and how much of a role they play in our existence?
Mm-hmm. So I really love this opportunity of talking about it. It was not even just the senses, it was coming back or coming to our senses. Yeah. Which implies slightly also getting home again or getting sane again, getting calmer, getting more concrete, tangible. So I heard more things than just the senses themselves.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting because we nowadays speak about senses that are not just the 5 so-called classical senses, but also a visceral sense of the belly, torso, interoception, proprioception, the position of the body in space. So we actually have more than just those 5 senses, and we can also explore them. And because we don't try to look at it neurologically alone or philosophically, we are interested in our day-to-day experience, tangible, like in a tangible sense. We also can use our feelings and emotions, like we spoke about emotions being an antenna.
Yeah.
So feelings and hunches, or kind of a gut feeling, or feeling good or not good about this. It's also another aspect of a sense that is very, very important for us. And sensing our body, not just skin touch, not just eyes, ears, nose, smelling or tasting, but also the inside our skin. In French, there is this saying that says that to feel good in one's own skin. So in our own skins, how can we learn to feel good in them? So it's also kind of an interior sense. When I work with people, I also guide them on a journey to feel their body. A lot of it is in the head because we pretend to be in our heads. It's very interesting that we don't feel inside the head so much. We can develop attention there. So we are in the intersection between looking at the senses as something that gives us an information from us as a center towards the world and others, to have the senses also allowing us to feel again the embodied experience, like you mentioned. And to start to see the senses as doors to the inside, doors to the outside. Very important for our topics, because we also looked at how we make the body into an instrument. So I can take a sense organ. Again, an organ is an organon. It's a tool. So how do I take a toolbox of the senses and turn it into who I am? And not just sensing through the sense what is coming from the world. For instance, with my eyes, looking out, but also taking the step back to sense my own eyes. To turn the messenger into a message, or to feel my ears, not just to listen to the stuff, but to feel the medium, the moderator, the in-between. So we can start to speak about the doors of perception. Again, it doesn't have to be only for mystical things and spiritual things and divine things, because it can also become a very tangible door to feel now and here in a sensed way, in an embodied way, and both directions. So you open a window, you can look out, and from the wind can come in, and we have this interplay. This is very, very, very interesting. It's an interesting topic. Beyond the topic, it's an interesting practice, and it gets us seated again in our chairs, and suddenly we are in the middle of life, and it's a beautiful experience to play with. And in this case, I would say that we look at the senses as something that is mediating an experience rather than passing on information. We are not busy now with seeing something specific. We are interested in our eyes. We are not just interested in listening, let's say, to the sweet birds, because we are busy with the birds. We don't have a task. And yet we are alive, and the senses are there. And we go into this journey of experiencing them. Without it, it has to serve another purpose. We looked at those things in a few of our talks, but now we can really, I would say, play with them. And also, if it feels a little bit like a meditation, it's not also that we have a task to achieve in the meditation. So it doesn't have to be to serve, for instance, now that we must be necessarily happy or concentrated, or there is none of those pressures. And yet there is full catastrophe living, or coming back to our senses. It's beautiful titles. And to look at those doors opening and to sense them, and to just kind of wake up to the fact that they are constantly there. And one more aspect is also sensing our bodies where things are getting tight, painful, or something disturbs us emotionally, or whatever it can be, and just sort of come to touch those areas, again, as a sense, not as an official sense, but it's something that you do sense. And getting to be happy as a perceiver, as a person that can be attentive to specific places, specific areas, specific inputs, and take our place again in the embodied experience that everything is unfolding. Funnily enough, when we really listen, for instance, to the ears, hearing, many times we have a better chance to reach a sense of silence. Silence is a wonderful thing. It can be spiritual. It can also be musical. It can also be just peaceful. But the senses themselves are, on the one hand, very tangible. On the other hand, because they open doors, interesting things can pass through. And yet it can be very tangible. It doesn't have to be something sublime by definition in order to become important. So if this is okay with you, I would happily explore this together.
It's perfect. Many thoughts came to my mind, but I want to first go into two and hope that the others will come again. The first one was, what happened to our understanding of these senses? Because for a long time, when I was growing up, what we read in the textbooks and what was told to us was we have 5 senses. Everybody that I know grew up with this understanding, at least from the school system, that we have 5 senses: touch, sound, smell, taste, hearing, the usual ones. We didn't learn about the sense of pain. We didn't learn about interoception, the sense of how our organs feel in the body. We didn't hear about proprioception, our sense of where we are in space, where our limbs are. You have all sorts of fantastic or interesting variations and extremes of senses as well, that at least I did not grow up learning about. And since nobody was talking about it, I assume that not many people know about it.
What do you mean by extreme?
Like synesthesia, for example, when people their senses merge, or they hear something, but they also see and smell that, as well as what we would call extrasensory perception, or people who can hear things at a distance or see much more sharply or differently than others, often at the expense of some other sense or ability. Or blind people who get really good at echolocation, and hearing essentially doubles as vision for them. So there's all sorts of these variations and extremes, but also very clear additional senses that now we start to hear more about, at least in the if you are in tune with the healing arts or mindfulness or mindfulness-based stress reduction and everything that came out of that. There was a lot of popularization of there's more than just touch and sound and smell. There's a lot of sensing that happens within us, as you were describing. What really happened? Are you aware of, was I living under a rock or something?
I think you had a very, very good classical education. So that was exactly how we were supposed to be taught. But I do think that with similar things which we saw, we live in an age that we start to feel that there is more, 3 points. There is just more. And I think it's wonderful. I don't even know that of a definition nowadays of how many senses should we have added. But for instance, we speak about this 6th sense, which gives us an extra. You are right. There are people that have very different senses or sense inputs than us. I grew up next to handicapped children. My brother was severely handicapped, and he was autistic by definition, but with a lot of senses that were differently organized and built neurologically. So we cannot say exactly how he sensed things, but we used to call them colleagues. He and his colleagues had very, very interesting sensorial input, and their experience was extremely different than us, which also went into, sometimes we call it idiot savant. It's not a very respectful term, but it means people that have a certain brain limitation that also makes them have very advanced or very special possibilities, like calculating extremely fast or reading telephone books and remembering all the information in one glance. Yeah. Seeing a town and being able to paint it, to draw it. Being able to count grains of dust in the air. So this is just as an example of how even on the tangible, physical, neurological sense, you have a huge variety of senses. So we have more. And with perception, with people that have extrasensorial inputs, people that have an expanded perception, even if it's temporary via the use of drugs or doing certain rituals or sensing things in a trained way, because sometimes we can also train our hearing or our vision. There are people that have remote viewing. They are training on seeing things that they cannot reach with their eyes, but they can perceive them. So we live in very, very interesting times that we can also see how to train the senses. With martial art, perhaps you can see that people can train to feel behind them. Mm-hmm. Maybe not see it with their eyes, but to somehow have a peripheral vision or perception of what happens behind. People that are dealing with danger, physical danger, by bodyguards and people that do special operations, they develop kind of senses that, again, they can be very tangible senses. We don't look at it like a mystical experience, but they would feel, for instance, when there is an intensity of threat in the air. Immediately they go into their particular procedure of how to sense the world around them. So it's very interesting to go into this, but also to go into this from the perspective of what we are here trying to develop, a guide for our perception and for our attention, for our embodiment, not necessarily with the purpose of doing something very extraordinary now. But this is a very, very interesting field. So we can speak also about the different senses or added senses. By the way, I think the balance is also considered as a sense. Mm-hmm. Sensing our balance when we stand or when we dance, when we jump. And all these things can be trained. So if we have to use our ears and not our eyes for whatever reason, even temporarily, they start to take over. In the night, when our eyes are a bit less able to see it, like the day, usually we hear sounds in a much more elevated register. So those things we know and we experience them. And we don't have to make it into a mystical thing, but it's by itself a very perceptually interesting thing to look into. And I think on the way there, we start to wake up to something that is an expanded level of sensing, which is nice. So again, we spoke about being silent or being quiet, that suddenly you can hear better. So there is less of a chatter inside. You can hear better what comes. You can hear your own thoughts being formulated. It starts to be a very juicy, carnal experience of the world. You can taste, you can feel, you can sense, you can hear my belly is growling. So this is where I would suggest to go.
Yeah. Well, that was the second thing I wanted to go to, because as you were speaking, obviously all these different offshoots start to appear in my head, and I was trying to listen and trying to calm my brain down to say, first, let's listen and see where this conversation goes, rather than now get stuck on these sticky notes in my brain. So you mentioned senses in a way moderate the experience that we have of inside as well as outside, right? We have the ability to feel the pain, but we also have the ability to moderate the feeling of the pain. We can abstract away from that. Same when we are focusing on watching something but not listening, we abstract away from the listening part of the story. The birds are making the noise all the time, but we forget about them. Yeah. So there's that. But what seems to be moderating the senses themselves is my mental chatter. While I'm thinking, I'm not really listening to you, even though you're sitting in front of me and there's nobody else around. Forget about being in a meeting or in some other situation where we often spend a lot of time. Like we all talk about this lack of ability to pay attention these days, where everybody's tuning out to reading something on the phone or looking through Instagram, and if you would ask them 5 seconds later, they wouldn't be able to remember what they were looking at. So there's something weird that is happening about how we are using our senses themselves.
Interesting.
How does mental chatter come into this picture?
It's mental chatter. Can be voices that we hear talking to ourselves or thinking, or to forget something, or arguing with what we hear. Can be all kinds of things. This is just one variation. But the distraction of our attention creates many times an overload of input, even if we don't speak. But reading a text and then jumping to a message and then moving to a task that I have to do and to note a sticky note somewhere. This kind of hectic movement by itself creates an input, and many times it's overwhelming. And that's why I'm saying when we look at the senses themselves, it's oversimplistic to just describe them as 5 channels. They are constantly working. Mm-hmm. So if we have a tea and we might have a lingering taste in our mouths that we drink enough, we are not dry, it's not bitter, it's not sour, it's actually feeling well. It becomes like the birds in the background. If the air feels nice here, not specific smell, there is no disturbance of any odor, you can say, yeah, it's okay. Everything is okay, and it goes into the background. I don't have to be preoccupied with this. The touch is a little bit more busy, especially if we are constantly ticking, clicking, doing something with our hands, being nervous, all this. But when it comes to the hearing and to the sight, it's usually overwhelmed. So when I work with people and I teach them how to calm their eyes, the eyes are starting to flutter like butterflies, and they're a little bit concerned because if something is not okay. Yeah. But actually so much tension is being released, and it lets go of the entire back of the head because the brain is overloaded, and it goes to the occipital lobe and back with the vision centers, and it does something that allows the eyes and the muscles around the eyes to vibrate. And it needs to let go because we are, again, working with a screen and putting a lot of effort to really see everything, not to forget, or whatever it is, it's overloaded.
You think we are overloading certain senses much more than others simply because of the times we live in?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the Western world, since the Greeks, was very much oriented to the visual, to the beautiful. It was not necessarily hectic, but what you see was extremely important. It already goes back to Aristotle, right? That the vision is the most pleasurable sense that we have. By the way, the Jewish and the Hebrew traditions were audio traditions. They were against the visual sense. It describes even the eyes as less moral than the ears. Wow. Because you are following the beauty or something tempting you with your eyes, and you are following it, and it uses it even some not very flattering terms to how the eyes deceive us. Not about the truth, but about the moral value of how we are coveting or wanting something or getting passionate about someone. The eyes are there.
This is too fascinating.
The ears are much more the connection to the divine. In the Hebrew tradition, you might also know it from the Islamic developments. You're not supposed to have visual
objects.
Yes.
Idols, as they're called.
Exactly, idols. This was the danger of idolizing or idolatry.
You know why this is fascinating for me? It's because we know, for example, that we used to say that men are very visual. They get attracted to the beauty that they see, whereas women do take emotions into account, talking about attraction towards the opposite sex or the same sex, whatever is interesting for people. We now know that it's the divide is not so like men are visual only and women are emotional only. There's obviously overlaps there. But yes, men tend to be much more visual. And if these ancient religions, and even before Islam and Judaism, they started to notice that eyes were the a bit immoral, so to say. It seems to me that there was this sense of attraction and desire, and perhaps sexual desire is immoral, and for the people who count, which was men back in the day, it's the eyes that are the gateway. It sounds like a very kind of I'm maybe simplifying it in perhaps too simplistic a manner, but it seems obvious looking back or talking about it that they were onto something. They realized that people are getting hooked onto something, and it's being mediated through the eyes. And if you don't paint it, and if you don't recreate it, and if you don't imagine it, but you focus something on a different sense, that you would have a different mental experience.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, the Hebrew Israelite, Jewish, and then the monotheistic with Christianity and Islam, they took this direction to an extent. Christianity was extremely influenced by the Greeks and the Romans, of course, so it became much more an aesthetic, picturesque, and painting and beautiful sculptures. So they took this. It was actually forbidden in Judaism. So this is exactly the opposite side. But the Greeks and the Romans took this visual input into an extreme, in a positive sense, of how beautiful the world is, how beautiful bodies are, and palaces, and so there was an aesthetic element of the visual sense that was extremely powerful, with no remorse about it. It was just a different culture. We nowadays put everything in one pot, but actually it was a very, very different culture, and a very different calling of the senses of the body to participate. There is a beautiful story about Elijah, who was a prophet, and he was persecuted by the king of the time, Ahab. And he had to flee to the desert, and there is a whole story with him fleeing. And then he has a revelation of the divine power, but God does something very interesting in this particular story. He appears to him in different forces of nature. And then there is a storm, and there is noise, and there is fire, I think. There is all kinds of very powerful forces of nature that we all know. And he asks Elijah, am I here? Am I here? Am I here? And in each one of them, he can see, no, it's not yet you. It's not yet revealed as you. To make a long story short, there is a moment, and it's described in the original unbelievably beautiful. He says that there was a thin silence. And then Elijah fell on his face and bowed before God. So somehow in the hearing, and in this thinnest of silences, the sound of silence, there was something coming in that was overwhelming. And then he felt in the presence of the infinite. It's very interesting. Nowadays with meditation, there is interesting talks by a very funny chap called Rupert Spira, something. And he speaks about silence as a way of developing spirituality. So there is something there. It doesn't mean that we have to shut up all the time, but that there is something about our ability to hear that creates this lucid experience. So we speak about the senses, but not just as an information source, but as a medium to the outside, to the inside, and creating a free space to our eyes, to our ears, to our touch, that we can allow something to expand.
Fascinating.
This is okay?
Yeah, this could very well become a conversation about religions and how, in a way, religions have always been a way of making sense of the world, right? Finding our place in the world and finding our connection with the divine, and therefore it is all about our experience that no matter how much we try, it is physical. The physical part is always there, no matter what part of it we emphasize or switch to. So these wars have always been about mediating human-divine connection in a way, and the funny word that comes to my mind is that between Greeks and Romans and Judaism, the war was a visionary war, or the war over vision, what you see and what you don't see. And I mean, we have these saying, out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. Didn't Moses destroy a whole bunch of idols, or some of his associates? There's a story about that.
Story about Abraham. By the way, it appears, I think, in the Muslim sources, but actually it's not in the Torah. Okay. It's one of the interpretations that were circulating at the time.
Wow.
So it's a sort of a legend, in a good sense, but it entered the scriptures as if it, So Abraham was destroying, iconoclast, it's called, destroying the idols of his father.
Wow.
But his father was not such a bad person. It's a little bit of a story that is already interpreting.
But it's fascinating, and I would take this as divine inspiration now, because again we were talking about different senses being overloaded because of our cultural and let's say temporal states of being or existence. If Greeks and Romans were into visualizing beauty or making it visible through sculpture, through painting, and there were other elements that realized how distracting it can be when you're focused on this beautiful thing outside of you, and in a way reminding you to go back to silence. If we put aside all the other religious precepts and ideas and history of these tribes and nations, they're all talking about how to manage your physical experience, and in a way using some of these senses. There's a lot of song or singing or hymns in all of these religions as well, again kind of refocusing you using one sense in a way. And now we have this kind of in a way the extreme version of the same. We know, for example, that if you set your mobile phone to black and white, you will use less of it. The colors subconsciously attract you, like a bee to a flower, or like some animal to a flashing object, like a cat to a flashlight. We have the same kind of situation that certain senses are being hijacked, and we allow it, not criticizing the systems that have been created, but this is what is happening. And others not so much. So the sense of smell, for example, is in a way downgraded, not just because the cell phones don't yet provide a particular smell, but we have been living in cities, increasingly living in cities with great isolation in our buildings, that we don't smell the grass, we don't smell the trees, and the 2 times a year that we smell the grass, we get pollen allergy. Or we don't taste as much because a lot of the food starts to taste the same because it comes from, similar chemicals that are poured into it, and it gets cooked the same way, and we are all doing takeouts, or not all, but enough of us. So certain senses are really just not by my own fault, just because of the fact that I live in a city, in a modern city in the first world, and use machines. My sense of smell is getting poorer, my sense of vision is getting overloaded, my sense of hearing is also getting overloaded, but in a different way. There's too much noise in the air all the time that didn't used to be, or there used to be different natural organic sounds. And of course, because I'm busy all the time, I don't sit down to feel my body. So how the hell do we get out of this, and where does this end?
I would say that what you describe might sound like a lot of different things, but actually they boil down to the same thing. Mm-hmm. Embodiment is intelligence. There is an embodied intelligence within us. The senses are part of it. Mm-hmm. Our ability to manage our attention perception as well. But this intelligence can work both ways. It's like a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. You can condition the senses to specific tastes. Mm-hmm. You can condition the hearing to a specific sound. So the whole beeping business, yeah. And the same thing with the sight, like you said, with the phone. And there are labs that are particularly working in order to attract the senses. What you mentioned is a very, very good one. Tristan Harris comes from working with Google, and then he retired or resigned in anger. And he was working in a psychological department in Stanford University that was supposed to be a persuasion lab of how the devices become more appealing.
Yeah.
So this is exactly the programming of the eyes. And it can be different levels of programming. And when we start to see that this is one side of the sword, that we are intelligent, so we can be programmed like these guys. When we will come to talk about human learning, one of the things I would challenge, again, one of those challenging thoughts of how can we learn to decondition, to deprogram, but having a purpose of chosen directions of how we would like to do it in order to decondition the senses, decondition the eyes. Doing it in healing, it's many times to serve the purpose of the healing, of reducing symptoms and conditions and allow people to suffer less. So people that have a lot of headaches, they would work with their eyes and learn how to work backwards into their brain. So this would be the task. But here, let us be remembered, we are able to be conditioned in the Pavlovian sense, like the dogs that are salivating when they hear a bell. My belly is growling again. But we can also do the second level, what I call second and third level of learning, which means that I can go into something that was already coded within me and decode it intentionally. Not using drugs and doing something special, but already special enough, looking at my own coding and to learn to decode it. Nowadays, this becomes harder and harder because we are constantly bombarded by tons of inputs. You cannot read anything online without an advertisement. You see a movie, especially with the eyes, but also the audio, the soundtrack. Most movies, if they don't shift a picture and some kind of the visual input every few seconds, they will lose the audience. So we are hooked on the changing images because we constantly have to see what's going on. Our brains are novelty seekers, they call it in neurology. So we constantly have to feed the beast, and the beast has to constantly run, and it creates a rat race that we are unable to stop. And this is the thing that makes me worried. You can be very smart, but if you are unable to stop, you can be a very good driver, but if you are unable to stop the car, something is wrong. And this is the place where we're starting to speak about the senses in a different direction. Even children nowadays, in children programs, if the picture is shifting and you see now this puppet and this little mouse, and less than every 5 seconds, the children are getting hooked because they get bombarded visually. It's not necessarily the message or the stuff of the program. It's how it's conditioning the mind to constantly get attached. And this is the issue here. And I approach it from a different perspective, and I would like to emancipate our embodied intelligence, and with each one of our senses, to start to go into a place that we can decode it.
Yeah.
And here comes an issue that we didn't speak before. Our senses are not only reading the world, they read into the world. So, for instance, we see things as we project them upon reality. Because this is how it's supposed to be. Like, I can see now this cup from this direction, but I know that there is another side, even if I don't see it. So I project objects with specific sides to them. I can see a cube, and the cube has certain sides to it. I don't see the cube from all 6 sides. But I know that it's a cube, and I can already work with it. So we run around on a half-gassed reality, and it's already built into our senses. So we actually see projections of ourselves, meeting projections in the world, and correcting tiny errors. Just to see that it is a glass. It's not something. It's not a jar of something. And this is true for all our senses. Actually, we are not just receiving, we are intervening or interacting. And we do it so fast that it looks like as if the world is there.
Yeah.
But actually, we are constantly working, processing it. And I'm taking the extra step. There is a very interesting talk also by Rupert Spira and also by Donald Hoffman. He is one of the people that he has a case against reality. And he claims that the way that we are projecting a reality is part of our makeup, evolutionary makeup and so on, but it's not the reality itself that we see. It's like an interface of the world. Very, very interesting topics, and it has more and more resonance now with the world of the academic world, I would say. And I would like to approach it again from the embodied intelligence. If this is indeed so, that you and I are joined now together, creating this room in a way that we can feel, okay, this is our reality now. We are not going into little details, but we have a large projection of the situation, and we work with it, and it serves us well, and it's part of our interface. I said, okay, if this is the case, I can also step back by literally, in the embodied sense, going back to the embodied experience, to my senses, to my attention, to my perception, and start to work in a way that allows me to decode what I see. And this is so interesting, and it's also so tangible. We can really do this. It's completely fine. It's ours. And then we don't just chase the projections and chase what we are supposed to see for whatever reason. We can learn to de-chase, to decondition, to deprogram ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, just a little thing. If I would show my hand, we can usually think, okay, there are 5 fingers here. But we would naturally focus on the fingers because this is the tangible stuff we see. We could look also at the spaces between the fingers, and then we don't have 5 fingers, we would actually have 4 spaces. But for us, it's very natural to pick up because this is how we make sense of the world, and we don't have time to deal with it. If I would show you this, and it would of course be 1. Do we really see 1? No, but this is how we signify 1. But if I would bend my finger, and I would ask you how many joints does my finger have? We have 3 joints. Or if I do this, actually, an orthopedic doctor might say I have 26 bones in the hand. Or when I show you this, is actually I show you 2. It's the front and the back, not the 5 fingers. How do we divide the world? So we decided with our hearing, with our sight, even with our touch, to divide the world in a way that we have a common sense. By the way, common sense. It's also an interesting thing. And the common sense tells us that this sign, this word signifies this. And both of us agree, and we move on. Now, this could be very good because we say, okay, we want to have 5, I don't know, whatever. Then when we go to a restaurant and order for 5 people, we would like to have 5 plates of something. So everybody would understand that. In Germany, by the way, they do this for 3. In where I come from, it's this for 3. There is a Tarantino scene that in the movie that they mix this up and somebody becomes suspicious because...
I think there's also a difference between this 3 and this 3.
Okay, so these are the common things. Now, we have coded our gestures. We can also decode them. I teach people, for instance, to use their eyes because they are so much focused and so much on the screen during hours a day, to look into spaces that are open. That, like, if I would now look into the space between my hands, and I don't have exactly a point, but it's like I would look into the emptiness of the air, and everybody can even try this by themselves. Even here, if I have this deltoid, and I'm just looking into the nothing, I play tricks on my mind, because my mind would try to find something, and actually there is nothing.
Yeah.
So I already do something that, What's going on here? This is what we can do with silence. You described in one of the talks the meditation of the space between the words, and then you have spaces that are long and long and long, and then you hear all kinds of sounds that not necessarily have a meaning of the surrounding, and it's completely fine to have very, very long silences, or having spaces that you don't have to focus on something. So we can train ourselves in stepping out of the program.
Yeah.
It's exactly the opposite, I would say, tendency than to try to catch the film now jumps every few seconds to another picture.
Yeah.
Or another input that I can, or stills, it's not really stills, video angle, shooting angle. Now you see this one talking, now you see this one talking. You constantly have to follow up what's going on. It's a very smarty thing.
Yeah.
By the way, there is also a moment in Greek history where the theater started to move from soul theater, like the tragedies of the old days, to more sophisticated rational thinking. Yeah, so Friedrich Nietzsche has a very interesting analysis of how the Greeks started to play smart.
Right.
Now today we are following the same traditions with our art, with our entertainment.
Yeah.
And we know that it's unreal, and yet we are hooked.
Yeah.
This is the Maya and being so hooked on the Maya.
Yeah.
We know that the film is utterly fake. It's produced.
Yeah.
Yet we want it to be realistic. Because we want our illusion to be so juicy and yummy that it feels like as if.
Yeah.
One of the Bond actors, Brosnan, went with his children. He tells a story. He went with the children to vacation, and they flew in a little plane. And the pilot was so happy that he has James Bond on board that he told him, "Look, I'm going to pee in the back in case the plane does something. You know what to do. You are Bond." And his children were like this because they were so ashamed, because actually he doesn't know how to fly a plane.
Yeah.
But in the movies it looks so good, it looks so real. This is how we are constantly working. That it's completely illusory, but we really need it to be real, to fake ourselves.
It's sad because I don't think we need to describe to anyone anymore how useful and good for us this little bit of silence, or these little different, for the sake of simplicity, let's call them meditations, how useful they are. Whether you're listening, doing soundscape meditation or body scan, or some of these exercises you share with the eyes, or really just focusing on a sound or the space between the thoughts and words. And the experiences just get more and more fascinating, and it makes you feel better. It heals your body. It's great for you in every way. It increases your IQ points. Look up the research. We don't need to go into this, but we just have this sort of almost dissatisfaction with this experience, and oftentimes. I also used to say this, although I'm starting to change my mind, that is that it's hard for us to accept the simplicity. The truth is there's a lot of richness in this simplicity that we call, but we always want this input. It's like somebody who can't stop scratching a healing wound, that we just can't be with this for long enough that it would heal, so we just have to keep scrapping and then keep peeling off the skin and keep letting it bleed, that we constantly want this input. So there's something to be said about the fact that we are not really comfortable with the silence, and in a way we haven't been for at least 7,000-8,000 years, since Shiva started his revolution, and then Buddha comes along and tries to revive it, and then all these prophets come along, and the core messages are still over and over and over again the same, of tuning in to really experience what it means to be alive. So it's a bit crazy, and that now switching gears to going back through this process of healing and getting back in touch with ourselves is a very important topic to myself, because I think we all need it and we all should have the skills and the support necessary to do this. As an adult, it is relatively easy to decide. When we hit rock bottom, we usually decide, okay, now I'm going to listen to this podcast and read that book and try to learn and go to this MBSR course or get some sessions with a somatic coach. So we get to a point where it hits us, and then we can start to find our way back. Now, you mentioned your brother, and I have a little nephew who's autistic, and my sister's son. And he's going through the same process, which is he's hooked to the television because the colors are just fascinating for him. And like when he was younger, when he was already 2 or 3, he was literally this close to the TV as I am to the mic, like this close. And you wonder what's happening inside this little brain and where this is going to go. Now he loves the TV plus the cell phones, right? And he plays these games and he figures out the phone super fast. And you think, but he doesn't have any skills. He doesn't have the social or understanding different things. But no, he understands a lot of things. Mm-hmm. He has trouble with conversation. He can move about, he can do his things. He goes to school, but it's a school in Pakistan, so there's not much going on at the school, or there's not particular attention paid. So when I think about this child who's already hooked to colorful screens, to the extent that I fear that if that was not the case, maybe he would develop some more linguistic ability, and maybe he would always be a bit different, but at least would have some of this common sense, as we call it. Apologize to everyone if I'm using all the wrong terms for this, but this kind of makes me sad and makes me feel a bit helpless, because this kid has no idea that there are certain measures according to which he's judged and he's different. And not just that he's different, which would be okay because the family would accept and support, and luckily he's not completely dissociated. But right now he is also being hijacked and he has no control over it. How the hell do we help this child? How can we help him see what's happening?
This situation is extreme already for many so-called normal children.
Yeah.
So we speak about now there is a huge issue with the addictions to the phone and dopamine dependency. And also with children that do communicate and those devices do their jobs, but definitely you are touching something that it's not just about the tech, but about our ability to get hooked and what can we do about it. So I'm fully on board. There is one book by an author, I have to remember now the name on top of my head, but it basically was called Irresistible. Mm-hmm. It's not Adam Grant, but something with Adam with a G. Mm-hmm. And he is researching those technologies, but actually they touch something much broader. That we are on the one hand distracted, on the other hand we are addicted to being distracted.
Yeah.
So here we are going to talk about trying to go the other way. And sometimes it's almost like sensorial deprivation. People feel like the movie is going too slow. I cannot watch it anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, so classical music, for instance, people used to go to a concert. It would be okay if it's an hour and a half. There were operas of Wagner for 7 hours, like poor audience. But nowadays we have to have songs that are less than 4 and then less than 3, and everything sounds like a commercial. And we are so overloaded that in order to reach somebody, we have to scream at them or yell at them or tempt them or do something very, very extreme in order to draw their attention. So the entire culture goes on this slope. And it's a slippery slope, definitely. And it's also true for so-called normal people, not only for people that have certain brain damages or limitations. it's a hard word to say brain damage, but people with different needs, different capacities. And sometimes they are really very talented in other fields, but we all nowadays suffer from a lack of communication and lack of closeness, not being able to hear one another, even if we have perfect hearing. So I go back to the user and I say, there is something here about the driver.
Yeah.
It might be a Lamborghini that you are driving, but if it's drunk driving, this is going to end bad.
Yeah.
So how can we wake up the user? How can we learn to pay attention? And how can we decode the body as an embodied intelligence to get our senses back? This is the core issue here. How do we come back to our senses? And learning to start to focus on the input, and it might be a little bit of a gentler input than what you see on screens. By the way, also the algorithms of YouTube and others are showing you constantly more extreme content to keep you involved. Otherwise, you will move somewhere else.
Yeah.
So our movies become also much more aggressive and violent and tormenting, and as if we are in a cycle that this is what we consume, but this is also what is produced for us, knowing that this is what we consume. So, and again, this is the opposite tendency. We can see that we are on a rat race. We see that something is wrong. What you say, rock bottom.
Yeah.
But again, I very much like to be interested in things. I don't look for boredom. It's not that I want to hear nothing, see nothing, or just being in an empty place that has no sensorial input or stimulation. I would like to have the choice. So, for instance, you can play the padel extremely fast, and then you can go home and walk through the woods and being in silence. So this is the places that we can choose, or you can meditate in the morning and then go to work and enjoy the hectic telephones and talks and things, and let's go get and do, and there is an achievement, and then we can go back home and do something calm. Where do we have the choice? How do we learn to regulate this? This doesn't mean that we have to constantly be quiet. Doesn't mean that we have to be constantly hectic. Where is the driving gear? And this is the place that for me is so interesting with attention and perception, that we can get back to the gear and to the drive, to the driver's seat, and I can regulate the gas or regulate the speed, that I can go back to this place that I call a normal user, normal in a healthy way, let's say, healthy user that can choose.
Seems to me, I think, that the ideal is a balanced state. Balanced not in the sense that all of our senses and all of our experience or different aspects of it are getting equal amount of bandwidth at any given moment. But as you said, yes, we can have peaks and yes, we can have troughs. But on the whole, it should not be something that is overly reliant on one particular sense or one particular activity. I want to jump back because maybe we don't have the answers, but I like this exploration now, thinking back about my nephew. If I think about it, being somebody who does not have the same language ability means he's not able to communicate as well by the age he was supposed to or expected to, right? So before a certain age, every child cries and the mother knows what to do, and the needs are also simpler. But at some point you're expected to speak, and he obviously didn't. And over time, later on, we realized there was something not usual about this. If you have a situation like this where there's something that you need to do and it's not working, at some point, also at adults, we know this, we get bored or we get angry or we get unhappy and we find ourselves a distraction, right? As an adult, we watch a movie, we go smoke a cigarette, we get yet another coffee, we go do something. So we know what our go-to pleasure is. And if you're or escape is. So as you were saying, it's not that we want to be in the box all the time. We want to feel well, But if something is not working, we find the alternative, or we know what our usual place where we would feel comfortable again or okay again. And for this child at that age, it's visual stimulation, which was easily available. And definitely, thanks to all these algorithms and processes in the background, made to hook people, made to hook adults. What chance does a child stand? I like this parallels. So essentially, there's something that is difficult and uncomfortable, and there's something available that is comfortable. So our natural tendency goes towards, okay, fine, I tried the uncomfortable thing, let's go to the comfortable one. Yes, we can make this choice. Again, maybe this is more of right now, this is a personal thing for me, because I would love to be able to help my nephew and see him flourish as anybody else, not necessarily the same as everybody, because he's not the same. And we even talk about uniqueness, between the rest of us who are supposed to be much more similar in our habits and everything else. How does one start to work there? And maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be about my nephew who is autistic in his own way, but for somebody, let's say, who's not fully signed off on this transformation journey, but maybe needs it. So what is the path back? Would you start with really trying to give more space to different experiences, just to wake up the different senses or different ways of feeling, thinking, or is it really about what are the different ways, balancing it out over time, creating an alternate peak experience just to have a sense of it, like, for example, people who are resistant to depression treatment go and have a mushroom trip or psilocybin trip that is overseen by doctors. So that's like creating really a peak experience, not over time balancing out of the situation, but a different experience that is so different that and thanks to the magic of the mushrooms, somehow balances it out for them and has a lasting impact. What are the different ways how we can approach this?
So, it could be a professional or personal tendency of mine. I find so much beauty and power in the now that I would not necessarily need to bombard it with something super special.
Right.
So the drama of the universe is for me big enough. I don't need a bigger universe to. So how do we start with what we already have? And there are two approaches or two strategies. One of them, for instance, if I would meet with your nephew, and I have done it with my brother as well, I would work with stimulation of touch.
Okay.
That many times was replacing the very powerful, let's say, visual input by a different sense, but it comes with closeness and with comfort. And the touch suddenly could bring something different into the equation. So this would be one way. But let's say that we switch between the senses. This could be one strategy. What I usually do with people that I work with would be more to delve into the very physical, and in the physical to discover the perceptual.
Right.
It might sound like I smoked something, but I'm really standing behind that. So even now when we speak, when we look at the most hyper-realistic sense that we now have is the eyes. Because the entire culture everywhere is a visually obsessed culture. And I would show a person how to notice the eyes, notice how they see, but also how they can sense the organ itself.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if I close my eyes and I feel my eyes, and I'm not just attached to what I see, I start to take a step into the body. This is an embodied experience, and I can start to sense the eye itself, and the eye socket, the eyeball, the sensation behind the eye, how it goes into the head. I'm taking the sense and I shift within the sense, not to another sense, like from eyes to touch, but from the sight into the sensation of the eye itself. And from the eye itself going backwards into the head, sensing the back of my head, starting to do a journey of sensing from the eye moving backwards. And allowing the person to sense the physical, but very quickly it starts to go into the perceptual. Yeah. And we can also later go into specific things, even if it's in a separate talk, but because we can really do little exercises with this. Or even if I would heat my hands or warm up my hands, and I would place it around the area of the sense organ, if it's the eyes or if it's the ears, and I would start to feel my head, again, not just the thinking head mentally running, but starting to feel the area of the ear and sensing from the ear. It's very interesting to see, because even if I keep my eyes open, by shifting to my ears and really listening, my eyes are not so much focused and not so busy as before. And then I can start expanding to the sides. And when I have now the front and the sides, and if I learn to travel a little bit more into my head to the back, suddenly my head, instead of becoming a very linear thinking, very fast track mental player, I start to have a surround, sort of. I'm starting to have a sensorial space around me, and I expand there. For many people, for instance, it's the position between moving forward and suddenly leaning back.
Yeah.
And time starts to slow down, and there is something happening there that I can start hearing. I'm not so obsessed with what I see. My eyes might even float somewhere. I'm guiding people often to allow the eyes to float a little bit above the horizon, because they are constantly on the screen height. So just by moving the eyes slightly elsewhere, I already, within the same sense, I already play a different music. And then something starts opening, and I can allow other senses to come through. Yeah? These are the places where we start to do this. So it doesn't have to be necessarily sense deprivation. There are also very interesting things that you can do. It sounds a little bit cuckoo, I didn't do it myself, but you can go for hours or even days into a very, very dark surrounding that there is absolutely no input for your eyes. And after a while you start to go into certain kind of perceptual revelations, or people that can bury themselves in the earth, in the soil, in the sand, except breathing or face maybe for hours, and they come out with very different energy from the ground. So you can do it in different ways, but within the sense itself we can work and expand. And then it's very interesting what you mentioned about the physical, and it's a bit like quantum physics nowadays and what we had discovered about the universe. When you really go into the physical, you find yourself bouncing to the perceptual. And this is what happens to the senses. So we go into the physical sense, or we sense the body, the interoception, the heartbeat. And then we discover within this something expanding perceptually. Those are the moments that it starts to be interesting. And this we can turn into some kind of practice as well. And just to remind ourselves that also when we go to practice something, it doesn't have to have a specific methodology, that this is the right way and this is the only way, or there is a competition of what should be the right way and so on. But all these are doors that allow us to journey within and to journey to the outside, without. And by the way, it's very interesting that this is where biologists, for instance, they discovered that the intelligence of the cell or the organism is actually on the surface. And if we look at the surface not as an object, closed object, but as a membrane, as an area that diffuses to the outside and to the inside information, we can start to see that when it works both ways, this is a healthy balance in an organism. So when we now look at the senses, and there are doors that open to the outside and to the inside, we can have it also there. There is something more intelligent in our ability to play between the two realms and to balance them. Like you mentioned before, when I have a lot of mental noise, it's difficult for me to listen. So I can find a way to balance the hearing, and I can come with more inner silence to listen, and I can think with more intensity and then formulate my thoughts to the outside, and there is an ingoing and outgoing flow. This is a healthy use of the senses. So then I think this would be a very, very interesting thing to explore. Even if it's today would be a very, very long thing to go into the practice, we can also go into the practice and just to start questioning and sensing, what do I really feel? What do I really see? How do I hear? And what do I hear? And then I start with the questions, entering this realm, and relatively quickly it changes something about my sensory experience. Not by adding a sense that is not there or doing something very extraordinary, but by tuning in to the real input that I already have. And I find it very nourishing, because otherwise this hyper-realistic overload of impressions, it's a little bit like you put ketchup on everything. Or a lot of sugar, or a lot of salt, or mayonnaise or something. Like everything is loaded with so much taste that in the end it feels like, okay, I even eat ice cream with ketchup because I cannot do it without, It goes a little bit la-la. So it might sound for people in the beginning as if it's less exciting. It's less loaded with monosodium glutamate, this ingredient that makes our taste buds going berserk, our brains as well. It's not very healthy. But it doesn't mean that we have to go to the extreme and now I have to become a nun or a monk or to go away from the city. I can actually do it within the tangible realm of my experience and start to sense it. Just as an example, again, no worries, we can go into all of these practices. I show people sometimes a very simple exercise of concentration that I loved it when I discovered it for myself, and then I found out, of course, like anything else, that it already exists in another methodology. And it was just about bringing it was a little bit different, but bringing the tips of the fingers together and bringing them in a very specific flowy movement. When I breathe out all the air, there is a little suspended moment where I just allow the slightest touch possible of my finger and my thumb, and then the next finger, and then the ring finger, and each one of them combined with the breathing. And people were doing it now. The amazing thing, because you have to concentrate, to coordinate. And if you do it with two hands, it's really demanding to find this exactly the same moment. And of course, you are happily failing, but the thing is that it brings about your attention perception. And it's such a light touch that, and we are so sensitive here, that actually the lighter the touch, the more powerful the experience is. And in the end, you really feel your fingertips being fully alive, like as if you can feel the air. And it comes from relatively small input. It's not hard. It's not sharp. It's not with effort. It's the opposite. But it just coordinated in a way that you can work with it, and it does something very special to your senses. And we can combine it. We can do the practice as well, but we can combine it with eye movement, with breathing, so it has enough sensorial input. And this is what actually creates flow. that attention is saturated in the activity. So you can run 42 kilometers, which I would not do, sorry, but and get the flow after 19 or 20 kilometers. You go into a rhythm and you feel that it's really perfectly optimal experience. But you can also induce it by saturating the attention with specific things that you can play and find how to create them. Cyclical motion, for instance, that you really do it, a bit like the breathing in and out. It can come with a movement. It can come with the way that the eyes are working. A lot of those things that I work with, because I also adapt to the position where we are now, that we cannot do something more than a minute or 2 minutes unless we take a retreat in the Himalaya somewhere. Very difficult for people to find a place that is free for them to do that. So I'm trying to do something very minimal, very short. But within this very short distance, to do something that costs you 7 breaths. And this, when you do this, if you count, it's really 7 steps. And you're already over a minute just concentrating, combining certain things. For instance, or you do something with your eyes, even if it's short. And I'm telling people, full disclosure, I'm going to trick your mind a bit, but don't worry, we do it together. Nothing bad is going to happen. And we just take the eyes out of the fixation of the screen. Like if I look now at the mic, more or less this is where I would work. So my eyes are there. It's like a super fixed thing. By the way, autistic children, and this is something to think about, they have an amazing ability to concentrate for hours. My brother could watch water. He could pour water or flush down the toilet for half an hour. It was horrible because, you live in a desert. How do we get him out of the toilet? Because he just loved the water. So he was completely focused. Nowadays, normal people like us might have issues with being focused. Those people are hyper-focused. They are unable to shift away. We cannot continue to think in such narrow-minded terms, like I have to find a way how to focus children. I have to teach children a whole array, a whole toolbox of possibilities to focus when they want, to shift when they want, and then I can start to have an intelligent user. This is the place where it goes to. So when we are able to saturate our attention, even for a short span of time, let's say 2 minutes, and I can combine those things, I become focused for a short time. And then I can bounce back into whatever it is. And what I'm doing is tricking their senses from the focus that they're in to a different place. So, for instance, if I take my eyes a little bit above the screen, above the head of the person I'm talking to, I'm not trying to be impolite, I'm just kind of going a little bit beyond, because we are also looking at one another in the eyes. And usually we even pick one eye. It's often the right side of my visual, it would be your left eye. And we are locking. And we cannot not, because it's like maybe it's not polite or something. But if I'm starting to play with it, and let's say take the eye, because again, the eyes are so much dominating our experience, and I take the eye a little bit above the horizon, we spoke about that. But if I take the eye all the way up, here, I'm completely out of anything usual that I'm doing. Like everything is usually this. And if I go there and I start to teach the eye, for instance, to go on the periphery of the visual field. Okay, now I'm moving on my head a little bit, but if I move my head less, and just the eyes do this kind of thing, I'm stretching my eyes out of the habitual place. We already work in a place that is almost a bit like the drug experience. I already take beyond my normal borders. The same if I go down. Many people, by the way, they discover that the muscles are so fixed and fossilized that they cannot even go there. They have to jump certain places. So they get a sensation of the eye in a different way. I can move in different lines. I can do 8 movements, like infinite movements, and allow the eye to do this. And when I do this, my entire world is starting to blow away from the normal habitat without smoking, injecting, or very, very easy things. And I just do it for a while. And then when I let the eyes rest, they start to recalibrate in a way that sometimes I cannot understand, or I don't have to tell myself a story or a scientific theory. Why it does this? It just zzz, and then people get a very sometimes glossy or sometimes dreamy eyes, and they can come out of a training like this with something that the eyes can recuperate, or they can feel, they can see different.
Yeah.
Many times those experiences, for instance, you feel the air as if you don't see the air because it's transparent, but sometimes you feel as if the air becomes more physical. There is something there, the air. It's a bit more milky. So the senses are starting to have a different input. With hearing, it's very deep. We don't realize how deep our hearing goes. And hearing is more emotional in a way. It has something that works into our hearing when we are able to reach silence, for instance. It's a very powerful hearing experience. Maybe not so much a visual thing, because it's not that we see nothing. I could close my eyes and see nothing. But with a hearing, it really feels like it goes very, very deep into us. And transform something in our experience of time, interestingly enough, or presence. With the skin, again, just to be reminded that our skin is our largest sense organ. It has multi-layered tissue and a lot of different sensors, neurologically or medically speaking, but it's also covering the entire body. It's the primordial sense. It's the first sense that we have, actually. And to an extent, the rest of what we feel and sense comes from the touch, not just touch with the hands, because sometimes when we speak about touch, we think here. Yeah. But if each one of us would now sense the back of the chair, or the clothes we have on us. Yeah. We wouldn't pay attention to it, but actually the skin is there constantly sensing what's happening. If it's not comfortable to sit, I have to change position. My skin, chair, it's too hot, getting sweaty, sticky, I need to... Yeah. This is something that my skin would talk to me. And it's the largest sense organ that we have. So I can play with the movement, for instance, when people dance, and if it's not just about dancing, but it's about sensing, I can do something that I can sense the world through my skin. If I can relax my eyes, I start to have a very interesting experience of the space. So hearing, many times the silence create a kind of a bubble space, that peace. The skin is literally a space. It holds a volume, and it's a membrane. Not to mention that our skin, all our bodies, is an ecosystem of microbiome, of little creatures that are crawling all over the place. So we're literally alive with them. I don't remember how many, but we have a lot of places in our bodies where those creatures live together with us. So
that is a big one.
Yeah, this is inside, but also the eyes, and there are different places, hair, and different places that are the armpits, everywhere. It's all teeming with life. So when I sense my skin, I can say that it's my skin, but actually it's our habitat. And I can feel it going in all directions. All these things are as if physical, but a few steps down the line, they become perceptual. So I can now look at you, and if I would like to concentrate off the back of my head, and I can get better and better in traveling, I travel in my body in a way that suddenly I start to feel a space. Because if I feel here and I look there, it's not that I don't want to look at you, I just have a much larger input of the space that we now share. Or the same thing from the sides, the same thing from below me or above me. It becomes a very rich environment of sensorial experience. Yeah. And it's ours. We don't have to download it. We don't have to buy license. It's just there. And again, when we step from the autopilot into the experience, it starts to become very rich. Those are the places that it starts to be interesting. And for many people, to reach this feels like they have to work very hard. Again, I have to jog, I have to stretch, I have to bring myself to collapse physically in order to have this experience. But actually, we can do it it doesn't have to be so extreme. Maybe from your experience, you know it from a different place, but people can wake up to their body through pain or effort or sweaty and experience and so on. We can also do it in milder ways.
Yeah.
But just to have the guidance and the dignity that it's okay, that we don't go crazy, that we can feel, those spaces. I can say from my experience that I enjoy it very much. I guess my friends, I had a lot of friends that took drugs. For me, it doesn't work. Not even, it just doesn't.
Have you tried
appeal
it?
To me, no. So it's something that I found myself in a different path, or different people that have a lot of experience with more active things. But still, I think it can be also done in a mild way that is not necessarily to push it into extreme. It's a bit of this masculine tendency, maybe, of our culture nowadays. But if I go into this place, there is a lot of lucidity. There is a kind of a silence or a clarity. If I have to write now, I'm working now on the book that we want to do, the field guide. If I have to go into this creative place and I start to do it with my senses and then go into attention and expand, I invite in a way kind of it's a bit like a puffy sense that the senses are not empty and the information is not flat. Things are expanding into something that I cannot even say what it is, but it becomes something that I sense, like the sensorial input starts to expand. And if then you think, it's not just a word, it's not just a concept, it's not just a line. You can start, it's a bit like working with clay, but the clay is invisible, perceptual, that you can start to see or to feel it. And then you don't have to think a sentence, but you can feel how the thoughts or the thought now wants to be articulated. And you follow the certain flow with it. So that's what I'm saying. It doesn't mean that we have to stop thinking. We can learn how to transform our thinking. But we definitely have to be able to reach silence. Because if we don't reach silence, and as a sense, I think we cannot be thinking responsibly or utterly out of our choices. We call ourselves rational beings, but our thinking, if we are unable to stop it, what we can call silence, is out of control. It's like thinking becomes a crash landing, and then I all the time have to put out fires or to write post-its and stickies, and I'm constantly on the distraction level because my thinking doesn't know how to. It's like a bird that doesn't have a nest. So naturally it burns out. But then silence, for instance, or the hearing sensorial input that becomes perceptual, allows me in the silence to become, to have a fresh starting point to think. And then I have a very interesting spatial experience of thinking. I call it sometimes thinking embodied, because then I go one floor under. Today, nowadays, apropos thinking, if I may, we look very much at thinking as an act of computation, because this is how we understand that computers work. So we can compute or solve problems that are defined by signs and symbols, like numbers or letters. For musicians, it's notes. We now know that our perception operates in one floor under. It's in the sensorial input and the raw plethora. It's the raw qualia before they are formulated into a sign. We are not yet there scientifically. I doubt if we are there philosophically. I don't have time to wait, baby. But when we go with our perception there, we feel the wind of creativity, or we can call it the spirit if we want not to make it too disembodied, but we can feel the wind that blows between or under our concepts.
Yeah.
That's the percepts. So this is the place that if I look at 5 fingers and I can move to 4 spaces, that I can decide which kind of reality do I want now to enter and how do I want now to project it, or if I don't want to project it all. I can also look at a finger and a hand and not even be busy with how much, and just look behind it at the wall. I can travel anywhere I want. There is something there that I'm able to travel, and this is the funny place. Our perception is connected to the world first there. In the raw plethora of experience, this is where the senses are starting. Then the eyes can formulate a letter, or a symbol, or a sign. And then I can start to munch on it with my mind. But perception of steps has one step before that.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the hearing. We can have the words that we hear, but we can also go into the hearing before the word is understood as that word. As you know it from speaking many different languages, you know that sounds, when you hear different languages, you can catch a phrase in a very different way, or a word can mean something different in different contexts. Yeah. When we do this, we enter an infinity of possible contexts that start to make the world very rich, because we can see it from different angles. And if you are able to participate and to choose in which angle now I wish to enter, then I can start to play creatively with my own perception. And then the senses become perceptual. It's not just physical. There is this Chinese saying that the most important part of the vessel is the emptiness inside.
Yeah.
So this emptiness, when I see a glass, I don't look at the emptiness, I look at the glass, because this is the object.
Yeah.
But it's like we discovered in mathematics in India in the 9th century or so. I think they discovered the zero. It was a huge thing. But how can you denote a symbol of something for something that is supposed to be a nothing? Now we know how to go there. Can we go there perceptually with our senses and to hear the nothing as a silence? And by the way, silence is extremely rich of noise. There is so many different sounds. And the skin, even if you don't clasp something with your hand, there is so much feeling if we pay attention to it. We are real infinite creatures in the senses, and every time we open them, every sensorial input becomes a door. And then we can sense ourselves sensing it. We can sense how the world is being felt, hear or see it. And we step into a very, very interesting thing that many people reach when they are perhaps under the influence of drugs. But it's actually built into our sensorial input. We can do this. And then it starts to be very, very interesting. Well, like if I feel the glass and I don't just hold it, but I want to sense the temperature. I now hold it for a few seconds, it starts to get warm. So it's not cold like it was before, or cool. Yeah. And I sense how much weight, how much effort do I need to have in order to lift it or to keep it. It starts to be something that I can interact with from the perspective of a perceptive being and sensing being, relatively then operate the glass and operate the tea. I move from the functional to the perceptual. And it creates a lot of beauty in our lives, and it's actually already happening. It just allows us to kind of wake up to the middle of it. And even if today would be too long for a training with it, we can happily do it. It's very easy. It's very tangible, and And it's also I think it makes the world very rich, and we see it with fresh eyes, like babies. It's very creative. The other day I spoke with my son. We walked past the trees, and he is now 7, but I'm trying to occasionally drop a little seed to question things, to perceive things. And we looked at a tree and we say, yeah, usually we paint trees as if they are green. But look at the green. This green is different than this green. And that leaf is a little bit more, kind of sunburned and brownish. And the bark of the trunk is very, very different. It's more gray. So we can say, the trees are green, or the plants are green. But they are infinitely green. And some of them have, very surprising by the way, some of them have very reddish tissues. Sometimes in the middle of the leaf, you have a reddish or yellow vein around it, the typical green. So it's just a matter of starting to look. And infinity steps in, even if it's a small leaf of infinity. But you start to see infinite possibilities in those little things. So it's very interesting to see that children can connect to it very quickly, because now that he is busy learning how to draw properly or so on in school. But the properly becomes sometimes very flat. The sun is yellow. When we really look,
it's not yellow at all.
Or the grass is green. So we go into those like a shablon, like a scheme. This is the kind of a post-it that you put on that thing. That's the brand, that's the title. And when we start to lift them, they're full. So when William Blake writes this poetry, a piece of poetry that is very, very famous, and says, to see a world in a grain of sand, this is where he comes from. Or in heaven in a flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. With those kind of people, like a Sufi, I'm sure that Jalaluddin Rumi was finding those things, just beautiful poetry about this. And it usually looks like it makes huge leaps in our minds. And how can we get there? We can get there by starting to play with our senses and starting to see. And then suddenly you see that there is a raw plethora. There is something so rich in input that is underlying the branding of our projection and how our senses stick the names to the thing. And then the physical becomes perceptual.
It's a beautiful place to summarize and wrap it up for today, because you kept reading my mind, and I was going to ask about different techniques and also to include other senses, and you did that beautifully. And so to summarize, I think what I would say is that there's all these different things that we can do, and we can use as our guiding principle this idea of trying to see where we are either overloading a sense or overusing one above the other. We will all have different experiences of that. And to then try to come up with experiences that would kind of broaden the perspective on either the same sense or other senses. And you shared working with the eyes, following an object at the periphery, or working with skin, heating up the hands, putting it on your body, or trying to feel the distance or the temperature at different distances. With sound, one of the exercises I used to do was play any music and just listen to the music as it was going, and not try to be a bit behind or a bit further, not try to predict or not be in the previous lyric or the sound. Or you can just listen to your own thoughts and find gaps within that. Or pick a part of the body, hands or feet, and try to synchronize it with your breath and see how that feels. And so there's many exercises you already mentioned, and the principle underneath is similar. Try to use it in combination with some other sense, or try to use it in combination with breath. Breath is a great way to kind of have a metronome to follow. And what I would say is there's many more, and we will be sharing many more over time as well as over your different communication channels. But the most important part is that this is an invitation for all of us to be curious about our own experience, that the seeming simplicity of this experience is not a downgrade, but it is a door opener to incredible richness of experience that is within our reach, that we all can experience for ourselves, and it will be different ways for different people, whether it's movement or working with the eyes or working with the smell or mindful eating or walking slower or whatever your way is, that this is an invitation to explore. And to explore for yourself. And the message I take for my nephew, for example, is to perhaps facilitate that for somebody who themselves are not in a position to do this out of their own volition, to maybe facilitate similar experiences and to see where the balance is, and to find the path into it, because it's beautiful, it's helpful, and I think it's... as you have often said, or indirectly said, perhaps I'm paraphrasing, this is our inheritance, or this is the treasure that we all walk around with, that we kind of, in a way, trade for cheaper dopamine, which doesn't feel too good most of the time. So this would be my takeaway for today. It's an invitation to explore, and it's available to all of us.
Absolutely. And definitely I would also... because we just delved into such interesting things, I didn't want to force something on it, but definitely we can do the practice as well. Mm-hmm. We can take sense by sense. Mm-hmm. I would even say sense by sense. We can take the expanded senses that we have, that usually are not the 5 that we use to speak about. And we can also explore conditions like sensations or pain or uncomfortable sensation in the body. We can see how to approach this as a sense, and feelings that we spoke about last time, and how to approach it as something I can work with and play with, just like the rest of our senses. So definitely it's
a promise
yes,
that
commitment.
We will also create or somehow find a way, either through a series of videos or written word, that people have some sort of a guide towards these experiments that they can run themselves, and along with some notes on how to deal with different outcomes if they get a bit towards an unpleasant or too pleasant and you don't want to leave them altogether. Thank you so much. Another beautiful conversation, Eylam, and I look forward to many more.
Thank you.